This is the Initiates Podcast. Here, we create space to explore the path of initiation as we reawaken the forgotten wisdom that resides within us all. I am your host and guide, Natalie Grace. Join me every Thursday for an enlightening exploration of contemporary spirituality. It's my honour to journey with you. Welcome, friends, to the Initiates Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm going to be talking about intuition. I'll be exploring the concept of intuition from both a spiritual and a rationalist perspective, and I'm going to be sharing my own journey in developing my connection with my intuition. Connecting in with your intuition can really enrich your life, and in my humble opinion, it's the easiest path to self-sovereignty and also to awakening your psychic gifts. So later on in the episode, I'll be sharing ways, tips and tricks to help you connect with your intuition and learn to trust your own inner voice more deeply. Let's journey. Intuition is seeing with the soul. Dean Koontz. Intuition is a really fascinating subject because it's something that we all have, but it's not something that we all trust or value or use or feel connected with. And in the spiritual journey, intuition is really a superpower. It's kind of like a gateway into developing your psychic senses. It's also a gateway into really valuing your own inner authority. So in episode 2, I spoke about soul sovereignty as a concept and how important that is as a spiritual being to feel free and like the ultimate authority in your life. Well, it's hard to have that authority without having trust in your inner voice, and that's what your intuition is. And in my own journey, I think I've always felt a strong connection with my intuition, but it is something that I've developed, this connection, with more intention in recent years, to the point where I feel complete and utter trust in my own intuition. And that I think is the ultimate goal, because as soon as you reach that point, you are able to realize at least some form of soul sovereignty, which is incredibly powerful because once you have that level of trust in yourself as the authority in your own life, there's not much others can say outside of you that overrides your inner truth. So what is intuition? To me, intuition is your inner truth, the voice of your inner truth. It's the voice your soul uses to communicate with you. It is that deep sense of inner knowing, but it's also that instant bodily reaction, such as a gut feeling, that lets you know when something's not right or when you're out of alignment with your own truth or authenticity. Your intuition is always right because your soul wants what's best for you. Your soul wouldn't lead you astray. And so building that trust in your own inner voice, in your intuition, is really an important practice. And one of the keys to that is knowing and having full trust and faith that your inner voice, your intuition, always has your best interest at heart. So if you've heard my previous episodes, you might know that I work as an intuitive tarot reader. I work with my intuition as part of my trade toolkit. And the tarot has been such an incredibly powerful tool in helping me develop that trust in my inner voice and inner knowing. I'm not sure actually if I would have gotten to the point of trust that I have now so quickly without the tarot. So for me, it's been a really useful tool. I don't necessarily believe that everyone needs to use divination tools to help train their intuition. But if those are the things you already use and connect with, they can be a great help. And I'll offer some more tips and advice later on in the episode about how you can connect more deeply with your intuition if this is something that you struggle with. But as an intuitive, I work with my intuition to receive and deliver messages. And the messages come through my own inner sense of knowing. What this feels like for me, whether I'm working with a client or reading for myself, is that I'll obviously set an intention, first of all, to receive messages clearly through my channels and to deliver them with clarity and conviction. But really, it's basically having the intention that whatever message comes through, I trust is correct and I will deliver it as authentically as possible. And so much of this is about not questioning what's coming through, not allowing my mind, my conscious, rational mind, to interfere with the messages coming through. So it's almost like my physical body, my vocal cords, my brain are just a kind of channel to receive or access these messages of higher wisdom or this inner knowing. So for me, I have clairaudience and claircognizance, and it really is very strongly linked to intuition because claircognizance is an inner understanding. It's very similar. I think it's just a more kind of advanced tuning, I guess. And so using my intuition in a reading allows me to receive messages that I believe are much more personal than what I would be delivering just by interpreting the cards in a more traditional or standard way. It also allows for, I think, a more kind of personalized confirmation from the client, or if I'm reading for myself, from me, where there'll be a sort of intuitive response back, the affirmation that what is coming through very much relates to what's happening in the person's life. So intuition is something that's super important in my work. And I'm not the only one that uses intuition in my work. So when I was researching this episode, I wanted to know more about the more rational understanding or perspective on intuition. So a basic scientific understanding or definition of intuition, and also just practical 3D reality perspective on intuition. And very interestingly, I found a few studies that showed intuition being used by high-profile professionals. So here's a couple of super interesting examples. In a study in 2016, healthcare researchers found that experienced dentists relied often on their intuition to make complex and time-bound decisions. And science often justifies this based on the fact that our conscious minds can recall lots of stored experience and stored knowledge from the past, knowledge that's been acquired through years and years of experience working the job, for instance. And therefore, intuition is not just this inner sense that's kind of from this magical soul message. It's rationalized by being about the way that we access very quickly our lived experience. And interestingly, this 2016 study showed that the choices that were made in this manner using intuition were often superior to the choices that relied on just evidence and rational thought alone. Another example was from the business world. So out of a sample of 36 CEOs, 85% of these respondents confirmed that intuition was central to their decision-making process. And that was a study from 2014. So here we're seeing examples of esteemed professionals who are generally regarded as very rational, using and valuing intuition in their professional work. And science recognizes the role of intuition in the process of making decisions. Many scientists propose that process to be a dual process, that the decision-making process is split between intuitive or experiential and analytical or rational decision-making. So some scientists that have written about intuition, one is Hogarth in 2010, who suggested that the essence of intuition or intuitive responses is that they are reached with little apparent effort and typically without conscious awareness. They involve little or no conscious deliberation. So from this perspective, Hogarth is saying that intuitive responses are very fast and require very little mental processing, and it's a subconscious process. Seymour Epstein offers a complementary insight. He says intuition involves a sense of knowing without knowing how one knows, based on the unconscious processing of information. So it's interesting to reflect on those scientific perspectives on intuition, because even the scientists in these cases are kind of admitting that the process of intuition is mysterious, that it's separate to the rational conscious mind, that it's a subconscious or unconscious process that informs our decision making. And I find that really interesting. So the most famous scientist is probably Albert Einstein, and he had something interesting to say about intuition too. I quote, "I believe in intuitions and inspirations. I sometimes feel that I am right. I do not know that I am." And so Albert Einstein here is highlighting the kind of overlap or relationship between intuition and inspiration. Scientists, inventors, artists, musicians will often have divine drops of inspiration that instantly appear in their deepest selves, that wish to be communicated and come out into the world. And Albert Einstein's recognizing this, that even the smartest man in the world, the greatest scientist, and even he sometimes felt that he was right, but had no idea if he was or not. And he, in order to achieve what he achieved, must have had incredible trust and faith in his own intuition and that divine inspiration coming in. And so I think intuition is really important. If you trust your intuition, it becomes much easier to receive these wisdom drops, downloads, and divine inspiration. And my understanding of how intuition and inspiration work together is that when you feel a sense of being inspired, when you receive a hit of divine inspiration that might appear to come from outside of yourself, or you just feel incredibly inspired within your own being, your intuition is the voice that tells you go with it. The intuition is the sense that this is something that you should explore, that you should pursue, that it might be worth working hard at, to go on the journey of whatever this inspiration is leading you towards. So in that sense, your intuition is the affirmation, the inner affirmation that what's inspiring you is in alignment with your own inner truth or highest path of destiny. your intuition guides you to that path. And once you start feeling what it is to be in alignment, then you can also start building much greater trust in your intuition, because you're receiving that real life affirmation as a response to you going with your gut and believing in yourself. So intuition and inspiration are closely linked. Intuition's also really closely linked to instinct. However, instinct and intuition are kind of different. Instinct is about self-protection, whereas I see intuition more about self-progression. Instinct is linked to the ego, and the ego's job is to protect you, to keep you comfortable. It's to protect you from danger. It's to help you from feeling scared, fearful. However, intuition really can help to push you outside of your comfort zone. So while ego might make you feel scared, intuition will tell you whether this fear is real and valid, or whether these feelings of fear is just a barrier you're placing in front of yourself to keep yourself comfortable, rather than pushing through and having a breakthrough and coming into closer alignment, which usually takes some deep levels of discomfort. So we've discussed how science at a basic level views intuition, and I've even given examples of how professionals in medical and business value intuition. But interestingly, culture is kind of what contributes to our distrust in our intuition. In recent years, we've just received the repeated message over and over and over that we must trust the experts, that we must trust the science. And this is to the detriment of us trusting our own intuition. But this distrust was planted in us long before the pandemic arrived. This all starts in school, deferring to the authority of the teacher, of the parent, having your inner sense of what's right and wrong, or what's true and what's not, being dismissed by someone else who knows better than you. And you know what? Sometimes they're right, but not always. Sometimes you know what's better for you. And as you grow older, you start to realize more and more that you've kind of lost trust in your own inner knowing of what's right for you. And I think those who are on the spiritual path and are going through doorways of initiation get tested in that way. Their trust in their own inner knowing gets tested. And this is when we start to build more trust in our own truth. And I feel like more people are waking up to this fact that they have been told or kind of brainwashed or manipulated into distrusting their own inner truth, their own inner knowledge, into suppressing their own inner voice. It's become apparent because we're starting to just get so much evidence that those experts that we place so much trust in have been lying to us, or even if they're not consciously lying, intentionally lying, that there's levels of manipulation and that we've been disempowered by detaching from the voice of our own inner truth. So this has been a really big waking up period where people are starting to realize how disconnected they are from their own inner authority and tuning back into their own intuition to really feel into the sense of what's right for them. And this is a big part of this mass spiritual awakening that we're all living through right now. So culture's role in the suppression of the inner voice, the distrust of the intuition, is really powerful, but also kind of interesting, because on the one hand, you have these societal systems that don't want us to trust our intuition. But then on the other hand, if you look at entertainment, intuition is often glamorized. If we're thinking about superhero movies, it's hard to imagine someone like Superman being disconnected from his intuition, right? Entertainment also kind of glamorizes certain situations where intuition is useful, like in medical dramas and crime shows. So I'm thinking of examples like the eccentric doctor who defies the rational evidence in favor of following his gut feelings. We've also got crime dramas where detectives might have a hunch about a particular suspect that they follow, even though there might not be any evidence. Culturally, intuition is also something that is deemed as inherently female or feminine. We hear of the term women's intuition when a woman has a hunch about something, and mother's intuition, which I think we can all agree is a real phenomenon, that the connection between a mother and her children is so deep that there is an intuitive knowing about what's best for her children. But women's intuition makes sense because intuition is something that is internal, it's something receptive, and it's something that isn't rational. And rationality is something that's more closely associated with masculine traits. So women's intuition, I think, is something that's fairly well accepted. And while perhaps women might be able to attune more easily with their intuition, perhaps, intuition is not something that men are blocked from accessing in any way. Intuition is inherently human. It's a human trait. My journey with my own intuition, when I look back, has been really interesting because I really can't think of a time where I haven't trusted my intuition. I've definitely can recognize times, especially in my recent past, where I was out of alignment with my soul purpose or soul's desires or my highest path of destiny. So recent times when I've been in a job that I haven't liked, but working really, really hard and burning myself out, or being in states of depression or illness in my body, for instance, where perhaps I haven't been listening as much to my intuition or hearing my intuition but not knowing what to do about it. But those times for me are actually few and far between. And when I go back to my childhood, because I was trying to think in preparation for this episode of those important times I've used my intuition, and it was kind of all sort of adult examples. But going back to my childhood, it's really interesting to think about because obviously the clairaudience, those gifts of clairaudience and claircognizance that I've known since I was very young, they affirmed my intuition. So when I'd have an intuitive sense of something, examples, I can't think of specific examples because it's such a long time ago and the memories are kind of faint, but I just remember hearing adults say things at, say, age 5, 6, 7, hearing the adults talk about something, sounding confused about making a decision, and I would know the outcome of the decision. I already knew what decision they'd be making, what the outcome would be, and I always thought it was kind of weird and that adults were so stupid that they didn't know what was coming. It's only in my adult life that I realized, oh, that was that gift playing out at that young age. And my trust in my own inner compass, my own inner knowing, my own inner voice led me to kind of just reject the societal kind of norms of those things you're told to do or to believe in, or to accept. So in my early teen years, it was really around establishing my own identity. My intuition led me away from the radio stations, for instance, that everyone else was listening to, and on my own path of exploration when it came to music and art and that sort of cultural experience that helps form your identity. As a later teen, it helped me retain freedom and sovereignty. I was a fairly free teenager. I got a lot of leeway with what I was allowed to do. My parents definitely weren't strict. However, my intuition was to be responsible. So even though from the outside people saw me as kind of wild and free, I wasn't drinking, until a fairly mature age. I wasn't putting myself in overly risky situations. I had the inner sense to be responsible because I was given so much freedom, which is a really interesting thing to look back on now. My intuition led me to pick subjects at high school that would allow me to study photography and art, which eventually led me to where I am now, working with symbols in the tarot, which is crazy to think about. My intuition at age 14 was to start teaching myself how to build websites, and that's something that's been incredibly useful in my adult life, in my work, having that understanding of how technology works. From that early intuition, I was able to build a career off it, and that didn't have much at all to do with my tertiary education. So it's really interesting to reflect back on where your intuition has led you in those early parts of your life. And in my later life, so my 20s, 30s, my intuition led me on some crazy adventures. My intuition was what spoke when I wasn't brave enough to use my own voice in ending relationships and transitioning to different phases of my life. I definitely allowed my intuition to lead me, literally moving to different countries and experiencing life starting again from scratch. I moved to Portland when I was 29. I only lasted a year. My intuition led me back home after that, actually, where I established my career, which my rational mind thought I was going to do in America. But when I moved to Portland, I didn't know why I was moving there. I did a road trip with a friend the year before, or not even 6 months before, when it was kind of part of the reason was doing that was for me to choose a place that I wanted to move to so I could live abroad and experience that. And I didn't have the greatest time in Portland. It wasn't the most interesting to me on that road trip, but I, for some reason, just knew that that's where I was supposed to move to. And it was just the most incredible experience of my life. The year that I lived there, completely free of any responsibilities, free to explore myself, free to be in the world without any pressures. It was amazing. And the people I met were incredible too. It was just I can't even imagine what my life would be like if I chose somewhere else. And so I'm so glad I just went with my gut on that, because it was such a huge life decision and it worked out so well for me, and it really shaped the next stage of my path that did lead me back home, and had a lot to do with establishing a quite successful career in technology consulting, which my intuition led me out of really not that long ago in 2018, after just feeling a soul-crushing absence. So that's a good time to lead into how your intuition speaks, the different ways our intuition speaks to us. Because in my experience, I can relate to the gut feeling that is a common saying that you should follow your gut feeling. But what does that even mean? And also the kind of deeper feeling of absence, of something missing. And I'm not talking about lack. I'm talking about that heart yearning, that heart-centered yearning when you're out of alignment, that something's missing in your life and that you need to change. You need to make some new decisions to bring you back on track. So the gut feeling, I would describe this as your intuition using your physical body to send a message to you. And we can feel this physically in our gut. We can get nervous sensations in our gut. We can get tingly excitement in our gut. Or we can just have a sense in that area of our energetic system that we're receiving a message. I feel like that's it can be really important messages that are sent through a gut feeling. That is something that has the power to override our rational decision making. That if we have a decision in front of us and we've rationally thought about it, yet we still have this pang inside our gut that's telling us, even though on paper that looks like the right decision, what's really best for you is to go the other way. It's really powerful. We can get a gut feeling about people, whether people are trustworthy or not. I think our gut feeling is also that physical embodiment of that instant reaction that the science talked about, that bypasses the longer taking rational thought process. The gut feeling isn't something that's felt instantly, and that's why it holds so much power. It's hard to argue with it. So I would say I had a gut feeling, for instance, about moving to Portland, Oregon, and that I didn't have a gut feeling with the other options on my could move list. And this is separate to that deeper yearning. So I think this is a deeper energetic layer of intuition, and it's also something that presents itself over a longer period of time. So it might take a longer accumulation of being out of alignment with your soul path, that this void or feeling of something being missing develops. And I feel like this is a very intuitive experience, energetic experience, because it is incredibly powerful, and you might be so far detached from yourself spiritually that this is the only thing that speaks to you. So I've really felt this before in a relationship context, that something deep, deep inside is missing, and you know it's missing, and your soul is speaking to you through the feeling of that void, I guess, the feeling of a void. I think this is also a voice that speaks to you, and I've experienced this in times of depression and despair, real prolonged states of like low vibrational experience, where it's almost like a spiritual embodiment rather than that physical embodiment of the gut feeling. It's this spiritual, energetic embodiment of being out of alignment, and it's prolonged and much more important, I guess. It's a message that can't be ignored, that stays, and it's there to help, I think, save us. It's there to help us make some really challenging changes and decisions in our lives to bring us back into alignment with what we're here to do. So that could be the hole that you feel, the lack of meaning that you feel when you're in a job that takes all your vitality but doesn't give much back to you in return. It could be the depth of sadness and loneliness you feel in a relationship that's kind of come to the end of its road, and you know you're no longer in alignment with the person that you're with, and that it's time to make the incredibly difficult transition into ending the relationship and starting again on your own. And it can be the feeling of something missing in your life, even when everything's on paper looks great. that you're just not in alignment with your soul mission, with what you're here to do, and you are feeling a hole where your fulfillment should live. So I feel like these feelings are also your intuition. It's also your soul speaking to you in a more spiritual manner. Another really powerful way that your intuition communicates with you is through a sense of what's coming, which can manifest as premonition. And I've had some really big experiences with this in my life. And the one that I will talk about happened more recently and really was the breakthrough in taking me from listening to my intuition sometimes to a place where I have ultimate 100% trust in the intuitive messages that I receive. And this was a premonition that I needed to move out of the city in 2019. At that time, I was living with my partner in Melbourne, Australia, and he's a pretty psychic kind of guy as well. We both had a very similar sense that something was coming and we needed to go somewhere with more space. And this manifested in all types of ways. So there was this intuitive sense of like this foreboding premonition that something difficult or challenging or negative was coming. And it did feel like it was coming to the collective experience. It wasn't like if I stay in Melbourne in a year's time, I'm going to have an accident and break my leg. It was more akin to the idea of life becoming really hard in the city especially. I wasn't to know that what was coming was a pandemic and that the city that I was living in would be one of the most oppressed lockdown places to exist in the world for over a year. So this demonstrates, I guess, one, that skill of claircognizance that I have, but two, the huge power and impact that this intuitive sense of premonition holds. It almost transports you to the energy of what is held in the future timeline. And it's that energy we're tuning into. So I was tuning into at that time through my intuition, the energy of feeling closed, of feeling oppressed, of feeling trapped, of feeling unable to be free. And while I didn't know how that was going to happen, what the vehicle for this kind of oppression would be, all I knew is that I didn't want to be in the city for a moment longer, and neither did my partner. And that allowed us to create a new plan to relocate to a regional town not too far from Melbourne so that I still could be in connection with my family quite easily. And even that was made extremely difficult during the pandemic because where I lived, there was what was called a ring of steel set up around the metropolitan Melbourne area where army checkpoints were placed on the highway going in and out of the city so that you could not enter without explicit government permission. You had to have a special permit and it had to do with work or medical, basically. And after going through that experience of just being like, I'm out of here, and we relocated our lives, we changed our life plans, we came up with ideas about a new business we wanted to run that was on a farm, having settled on a family farm, which just happened to appear at the right time that we got the message to move. Everything kind of fell into place. So when you when you take seriously those intuitive feelings of premonition and you take action, because it's ultimately a real sense of needing to take action. And there's a risk involved when you have a premonition about something. Like the most famous types of premonitions people have that we hear about in culture is people who have premonitions about plane crashes, for instance, and having to make that decision. Say in a dream the night before, they see the future timeline, the potential future timeline of that plane that they'll be traveling on in the morning crashing. They have to make that very important decision on the spot immediately, whether they're going to take that risk of getting on the plane or they're going to go with their intuition and honor what they saw in their dream and sit this flight out. So we've all heard of those kinds of stories. But in our own lives, these premonitions can happen as well. And since this experience in listening to my intuition, because once I moved, life got really difficult actually. Obviously, collectively, we went through a huge dark period, and this was aligned for me, as I'm sure it was also with many of you and many others around the world at that time. It triggered, or was one of the triggers for a really intense dark night of the soul, which I will explore with you guys in a future episode, because it was a catalyst for my awakening and shift from my old self into my new understanding of my soul self, I guess. I don't think that could have happened in the same way if I didn't move out of the city into this new space with this massive land around me. So not only did I get to feel more free while others felt trapped, and it was really helpful for my well-being that while people had this fence placed around them where they weren't allowed to travel beyond a certain number of kilometers, I was in a town where within that same distance I could walk to the beach. Or if we weren't supposed to be walking at all in these dangerous peaks of the pandemic, that I had my own beautiful sanctuary of farmland to be walking around to keep me grounded and at peace, and to help with those feelings of anxiety that I was experiencing at the time. This also coincided with a huge health crisis in my life, which is another thing I'll explore on a separate future episode, and triggered this path of self-healing for me. So this time was a huge catalyst for growing into myself, for meeting myself at my lowest and highest points, for going through the biggest portal of change, the biggest initiation when it comes to my whole entire spiritual journey. This was it. And it all began with me listening to that voice, that inner voice, that premonition that I had about what was to come. So I compel you guys, if you have this really strong sense of premonition, to really go deep and listen as much as you can, as intently as you can, and really go with your intuition, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, your intuition is the voice of your soul, and your soul would never lie to you. Your soul would never lead you somewhere you're not supposed to be. So if you're not feeling so connected with your intuition, if you have trouble trusting your intuition, I want to talk now about working with your intuition in a practical manner. And for me, what it comes down to, everything just comes down to trust. That firstly, an acknowledgement that your soul speaks to you via your intuition, and that you're willing to hear that. You're willing to hear that message. You're willing to receive it. You're willing to listen. And then the next step is really making an intentional decision and commitment that when you think you hear your intuition speaking to you, that you will actually take as fact that your intuition is right, that it's real, that you trust it 100%, and that you will listen to it. And this is really powerful, because as soon as you decide this, there's no room for doubt there. You've already acknowledged that you trust your inner voice and that you're going to listen to it from now on, and you're going to let it guide you. When you don't have that trust and you haven't made that intentional decision, then there's plenty of room for your rational mind to get in the way, or for outside opinions to get in the way of you going with your gut. So that's really the first stage, is to make that commitment and practice your self-awareness, practice the awareness of receiving these messages from your intuition, and practice your commitment to listening to and honoring those messages. And practice not letting your rational mind get in the way of this trust and this commitment. And so the second part, well, how do you do that? It's taking action on the messages that you're receiving through your intuition. So it's really about going with your very first feeling or sense or thought, and accepting that it's real, trusting it, and not allowing your mind to question whether that my intuition speaking to me. Of course it was. You don't even need to question anymore. Just take as fact that is the message, that you've received it. Go with your gut. And so you might experience some challenges as you're practicing these steps. So I've made some notes here about the different types of challenges you might experience and what you could do to kind of address those. Firstly, you might find it hard to recognize your own inner voice. And if this is the case, it's important that you make extra space for you to hear that voice of inner knowing. And the reason this is important is because it's easy for this inner voice to be drowned out by noise. And the noise is planted there on purpose to make it difficult for you to hear your inner voice. And the noise can be constant circulating thoughts, for instance. It can be feelings of anxiety, always projecting into the future. So finding ways to create sense of calm, sense of spaciousness, sense of peace in the heart space to mitigate those sensations of anxiety, for instance, or practicing an awareness of when your thoughts are circulating and there's not much space in the mind. Find ways to quieten that noise. So meditation's an obvious example, but even just practicing awareness that my mind is noisy right now. I'm going to go outside and just focus on nature sounds, for instance. It doesn't have to be sitting down and doing half an hour of meditation where it's so hard to clear your mind in that way. I really feel like making space is all about awareness. And with that awareness, you actively choosing what you want in your mind space and what you wish to release. And it's always helpful to choose the present moment and sounds of nature to take up that space, that noise from the outside world, so social media, TV, those kinds of things, plant in our heads to keep our minds busy. So once you've made a bit more space, you're practicing that awareness, it should be easier for you to hear these messages from yourself, to hear that voice of inner knowing, and to then practice those steps of acceptance and trust. Others might find it hard to build trust in themselves. And again, this is something that I think society pressures us to do, is to not trust ourselves, to trust authorities outside of ourselves. But I also feel like trust can be based on past experience. And if you have never had trust in your own inner voice, well, then, you don't really have anything to anchor into. So some things you can think about: know that your soul only wants the best for you. So if you find it hard to have trust, accept that your soul only wants the best for you. And therefore, this is a really great voice to trust. Another thing to accept is that your intuition is part of your makeup as a human. It is part of what's helped us evolve to the point we're at now. Our intuition is linked, as we've discussed, with our inspiration and our energy channels and our subconscious and our chakras. So those links prove that intuition, your inner voice, is essential to your survival, to honoring your desires, to aligning with your soul path. And it's part of our physical makeup as humans in meat bodies, as souls living a human experience in these physical bodies. It's also part of our collective makeup that has helped us evolve. Others might have a problem with their rational mind overriding their decision to trust their inner voice. So if you're finding that your rational mind wants to argue with you about this decision you're making, this commitment, what you can do is reaffirm your experience with your inner knowing. So you can think about those times in your life where you have listened to your inner voice and it was right. You can also think about times when you had a sense of something that was right for you and you ignored it. And you can look back now with hindsight and maybe have some regret or wish that you listened to your inner voice at that time. You can also think about the areas of your life where even with your rational mind, you would never allow an outside voice to override your own inner knowing. So this could be about your children, it could be about your own personal safety, it could be about your health. I feel like many of us need to work on this one because we've been so brainwashed into outsourcing our authority to doctors and the medical system. And this is a for-profit system that lies to us about a lot of things. So that might be something you need to work on, but definitely if we think about our own personal safety or our children, the safety of our children or the well-being of our children, we would never allow an outside voice to override our own. So there's some really good ways to deal with the rational mind having a problem with you placing more value on your intuition. Another way to practice your connection with your intuition is through divination. I mentioned earlier about the ways I've used tarot to help fine-tune my intuitive skills. And if you are someone who likes to work with tarot or oracle cards, runes, pendulum, dowsing rods, scrying, any of those tools, they can be really useful in affirming your intuitive messages. So tarot is really a good one because you can ask yourself a question and kind of have an answer and then pull a card and see what it says. Same with a rune, is this message that you're getting through the cards or through the runes completely different to your intuitive sense, or is it actually in alignment? And you'll start to notice that often when it's not a match, when the messages are different, you can start to analyze when your rational mind is getting in the way and pointing you to a direction away from your intuitive sense. Now, my final piece of advice is for those who feel extremely disconnected from their intuition, feel a deep sense of distrust in their own inner voice. For those people, energy work could be really useful. It could be time to seek some outside assistance, whether that's Reiki or some form of energy or sound massage, to move some of that energy, to have someone from the outside kind of being able to see where those blocks in self-trust might be occurring and work through those. There can also, it could also be really useful to check in with an Akashic Records reader or a past life regressionist or a hypnotist, for instance, to work through some of those inherited blocks or past life blocks that we might have that get in the way of trusting our inner voice. If you sense that you might be suffering from those kinds of energetic blocks when it comes to self-trust, but you don't necessarily want to work with a healer or energy worker right now, there's also some really powerful tools you can use at home. And one of those is flower remedies. So these are something that I make and work with frequently, and they work on the physical mental, emotional, and spiritual layers of the self. So flower remedies are a form of energy medicine that use the vibration of flowers, that energetic imprint of flowers, to harmonize discordant energies in the body. I was actually inspired by this week's episode. I realized there was a gap in my product offering. I don't actually have an intuition blend. So this is something that I've put together in response to this episode, because I actually do recognize that there's lots of people who probably do experience deeply set kind of energetic blocks or discordance around self-trust. And this is something I want to help with. So in addition to all the tips I've given, if you feel like you need something to work with, say on a daily basis, flower remedies are wonderful, subtle helpers in harmonizing imbalanced kind of emotional energy in the body. So this intuition blend is going to work on your trust in yourself. It's going to help build trust in your intuition. It's also going to help to remove that mental clutter, that noise that I spoke of earlier, so there's more space to hear those messages coming through. And I've also designed it to give you confidence in your own decision making, in alignment with your own truth. It's wonderful, gentle energy medicine. It's completely safe to use with no side effects. It's also very easy to use. You can just take it under the tongue 4 times daily, or you can just add it to your glass of water that you sip throughout the day. So if that sounds appealing, I'll pop a link in the show notes for you to purchase this intuition blend. So I hope those tips and pieces of advice help you if you are someone who struggles with trusting your inner voice. If you need any extra support or advice, this is something I'm obviously really passionate about. So connect with me, send me an email or send me a message on Instagram at the Initiates Podcast. And I'd be happy to have a chat with you and just talk through the barriers that you face in connecting with your intuition. Also, if you're someone who is well connected with your intuition and has some extra tips or guidance for others who might be struggling with that, definitely jump into the comments on this episode's posts on my Instagram. I would love to hear your tips and advice and to share that information with the community, because I think this is such a powerful thing we can do, and it's something we build on as we grow and evolve, and to share that knowledge will be really powerful. So on that note, I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you are feeling in deep connection with your intuition. And until next week, peace. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. If you'd like to work with me, I offer remote one-on-one soul map and soul message readings. Just check the show notes or head over to my website at theinitiatespodcast.com to learn more. You can also find links there to all the ways you can support the show. Thanks again for your time, and I'll see you next week.